We showed up at the Crooked River. It was pretty murky. It was not what we expected. There was a lot of vegetation floating through. We tried a bunch of different tactics. I looked around and found a bunch of little sculpin in the shallows, and I tried those patterns a bunch, and those didn't work. What ended up working was yellow bead-headed psycho princes. We ended up only catching a couple out of the group, whitefish and some small rainbow trout. Probably the most notable was my dad got sprayed by a skunk while hiking the bank, and we could smell him most of the day. Because the river was blown out, we gathered up and headed directly to the Deschutes. River right side above the boat launch, approximately a half mile up, and started targeting a couple of holes that we could find along the trail. It was a short first day because we had to figure out everything. There's a lot of rules around the Indian reservation. No fishing from your boat, limited access to river left unless you bought a special Indian reservation fishing permit. So the next couple days with the boat will be limited. And the first day we were devising plans for the next 2 days because we only had 3 days on the Deschutes to figure everything out. We caught maybe 1 or 2 the first day, just trying to figure out what flies were working, what type of water they were holding in. But ultimately, pretty excited to see more of the river from the boat perspective. We hadn't seen downstream of the boat launch to this point. We had just kind of hiked up and got our lines wet, and we were hopeful for the next day. The locals call the rainbows here red sides. They tend to look a lot darker, almost like a steelhead. And there are steelhead in these waters, but from what we had heard, they are hatchery steelhead, and that they have clipped fins. You'll see an example of that later. Having seen all the boats leave the launch the first day, we devised the plan that we were going to try to work upstream with our boat. We would ferry river left and river right whenever it got too deep for us to push the boat up. All these rules of no motors and no bank travel kind of forced us to do this. Putting in the work has its rewards. These are waters that have very little fishing pressure, and it was a good sign. As we're walking here, you'll see a fish feed in front of us. We also got a closer look at what the bug life is on the river, and that dramatically changed our approach. Here's us getting around one of the biggest obstacles of the day. It got pretty deep. It was very brushy. There were spiders and a bunch of nasty stuff in here that I wasn't too thrilled about. You'll see me ping a decent sized spider off Tom's back here in just a second. Nothing we really needed to worry about, but just the creepy crawlies. As soon as we got around this bend though, things started to shallow out, and it was pretty smooth sailing, pushing the boat the rest of the way forward. We probably pushed the boat for a solid 30 minutes or so before we started to find a good place to start fishing. Given all the stonefly activity that we had witnessed along the bank, we decided that that's what we were going to fish first. And so my dad found a good seam here that we were going to start on, and it turned out to be one of the best producing areas of the entire trip. At one point, it felt like you couldn't miss. Every handful of casts, you were either hooking up or landing a fish. Most were in the mid to high teens, really solid fighting fish lasting a couple of minutes each. They seemed to not give up until the very last bit. I'm going to let the video speak for itself here for a couple minutes. Same tactic, nymphing those bead-headed stoneflies just over and over. After the group landed close to a dozen or so, things got slow and we moved downriver a little bit. My dad landed a really decent mountain whitefish. We kept moving down after that, and Tom ended up with a nice decent rainbow. This being caught in a much deeper hole than the previous fish had been caught in. This spot seemed like a really fishy spot, so we ended up staying here for quite a while and giving it its full respect. We landed maybe one or two more from this hole, and then we ended up moving on. There was this one spot in the river that was kind of tricky to fish. There were these kind of washboard gravel banks and then 6 to 10 foot deep holes right behind them. And every 30 feet, it was repeating like that. And so I fished there for a while and caught this pretty decent fighting fish, but it was kind of a battle for footwork because I couldn't get the fish into a slower moving water, nor could I walk downstream or upstream for fear of finding myself in that 10 foot deep water. And so we kind of just fought it out from where I was. I finally got the fish in. I was kind of surprised that it wasn't bigger than it felt. It put up a really good fight. And I noticed that its anal fin had been clipped, And so this gave us some indication that this may be a hatchery steelhead. The day was coming to an end after this fish, so we decided to get in the boat and float down the rest of the way to where our campground was. On the way, we got a pretty good display of night hawks feeding just before sundown. This was happening at a pretty slow stretch of the river, so I stopped rowing and we just kind of lazily drifted along with the river and enjoyed watching the show. Once we got to the campground, we had to self-shuttle to prepare for the next day. I hopped on a Honda Ruckus and drove for maybe 30-something minutes, mostly gravel road. It was a fun way to end the day, though it got a little busier on the highway section. The last day, we decided that pushing the boat upriver was a good idea and that we would like to explore even further upriver. We ended up spending maybe 45 minutes to an hour pushing the boat this day. Once we had stopped pushing the boat, we had found ourselves on a good spot yet again. The first handful of fish seemed to be smaller than the previous days, but still equally as enjoyable. After fishing this spot for about 45 minutes, I hooked into my largest fish of the trip and possibly the largest fish of the group. You always get a little excited when you realize you have the big one on, regardless of what the big one actually is. And so I called in reinforcements for my dad to net it, given the fact that I didn't currently have a net on me at the time. This sequence of events was definitely the highlight of my trip. I'm hooked up with a big fish. My dad nets it successfully, and I wanted to share this with Tom as well. He was around the corner fishing some smaller water. I brought the fish over to show him, and when I did that, I realized that he was hooked up with an equally sized fish. And so it was really fun sharing that moment with Tom. Both of our big fish in the same net, and so we exchanged taking pictures. as we were taking pictures, we were sharing how we caught each of our fish. Tom starts to point out where he had hooked up with it, and then from then on we got some good video of the fish on release. We found a number of pretty decent sized smarks in this really slow side water. We broke out the dry flies and tried to see if anything would take, and they just weren't interested. They weren't feeding, they weren't hitting the surface. Still definitely worth giving it a cast or two. We then dropped down to the run that we were having a lot of success with the day before, and we managed to pick up a couple more trout before the end of the trip. At this point, you can see the smoke from the wildfires was moving in pretty thick. Things seemed to slow down as the day progressed. My dad hooked up with one last good rainbow before packing it in and heading down towards the takeout. All in all, this was definitely our most productive run, and in the future, if we were coming back to this spot, it is well worth pushing the boat the distance to get to this spot.